You ever feel like your whole life has been performed with the volume turned down while everyone else is screaming to be heard? That's how I lived the first 23 years of my life, on mute, dressed in perfectly ironed silence, groomed to be the polished daughter in a family that worshipped image like it was a religion passed down through generations. My name is Aurora. No middle name, no siblings, just Aurora, named after a goddess or a light show, depending on which parent you ask and what kind of day they're having. From the outside, we looked like one of those families you see in real estate brochures, chin up, camera ready, teeth straightened, and spine straighter. My mother, Lydia, was the high priestess of appearance. She could destroy you with a glance, her smile as sharp as a scalpel and twice as precise. My father, Charles, was the kind of man who valued pedigree over personality, who believed the world was divided into the accomplished and the invisible. And then there was me, the girl who colored inside the lines so well I forgot I had hands of my own. They raised me in a house where feelings were treated like stains, something to be scrubbed out before company arrived. We didn't do messy. We did martinis at 6 and quarterly donations to orchestras we didn't attend. We did legacy. We did perfection. So when I told them I was majoring in art history instead of business or law or whatever legacy-affirming degree they had already engraved on the family tree, my mother's eyes did this thing where they narrowed just enough to let me know I had failed some test she never admitted to assigning. "Oh," she said, voice dipped in disappointment, "well, at least it's not philosophy." That was how I learned the art of compromise: speak softly, smile often, and always let their approval set the thermostat of my existence. Then, like something out of a quiet storm or a forgotten dream, I met Daniel. It wasn't dramatic. There was no slow-motion moment where our eyes locked across a crowded room while violins swelled. We met at a community art event, him wearing scrubs and sneakers, me holding a tray of charcuterie samples for a gallery fundraiser my professor guilt-tripped me into attending. He was tall, not in the obnoxious way that makes you feel small, but in the kind of way that makes you feel safe, like maybe if the world cracked in half, he'd know how to put it back together with patience instead of panic. He listened. God, that sounds so simple. But he actually listened. He asked me about a painting I'd been studying, and when I rambled, he didn't cut me off. He nodded. He waited. He wasn't trying to impress me. He wasn't trying at all. He was just present. Daniel worked as a hospice nurse. A job my parents would later describe as commendable but clearly lacking ambition. But to me, it was the first time someone had stepped into my quiet world and said, "I see you," without trying to change the settings. We didn't fall in love like fireworks. We settled into love like a song you hum for weeks before realizing it's your favorite. We painted in silence, me working on small canvases in my apartment, him sketching in the margins of his notebook between shifts. We walked dogs from the local shelter on Sunday mornings when the city was still half asleep, our footsteps syncopated with the rhythm of shared simplicity. We cooked late at night, barefoot, often forgetting half the recipe, laughing over burnt rice and undercooked lasagna like it was the finest cuisine ever served. He was gentle in a way that didn't ask for applause. Which, of course, meant my parents would hate him. The first time I introduced them, I should have known how it would go. I dressed Daniel in his nicest shirt, brushed imaginary lint off his collar, and warned him, half joking, half terrified, that my parents had a way of making their disapproval look like politeness dipped in perfume. We sat in their dining room, the same room where I had been taught how to butter bread correctly and which forks went with which regrets. My father barely looked up from his wine glass when Daniel introduced himself. "Hospice nursing, you say?" he asked, swirling the Merlot like it owed him something. "Well, I suppose someone has to do it. Doesn't pay well, does it?" My mother, lips curved in a smile so tight it could have been carved from marble, simply said, "I hope this is just a phase." They said it like I'd brought home a stray animal with fleas and they were politely waiting for me to realize it couldn't be housebroken. That night, I cried in the bathroom while Daniel waited outside, too kind to say what we both knew, that I was ashamed. Not of him. Never of him. But of the part of me that still wanted their approval like a starving girl begging for crumbs. And so began the secret life. The quiet love I kept folded into the corners of my days, like handwritten letters you're too afraid to send. I stopped bringing Daniel to family events. I stopped mentioning him in conversations. I let my parents believe that I was taking time to focus on myself, when in truth, I was building a world with a man they refused to see. We moved in together after 6 months, not because of urgency, but because our lives just made more sense under the same roof. He brought peace. He brought patience. He brought a love so steady it made me angry sometimes, like I didn't know what to do with something that didn't need fixing. But the silence grew heavier. Not between us. Between me and the parts of my life that still orbited around my parents' gravity. Every holiday, every birthday, I rehearsed the lie of being single. Every conversation was a dance around the truth, my words carefully choreographed to avoid the subject of love. But love doesn't stay hidden forever. It seeps into your posture, your pauses, the way your face softens when someone mentions his name, even if you try to play it cool. And it was only a matter of time before someone noticed. There are moments in life that should feel like sunlight breaking through clouded skies, clear, warm, radiant with promise, and for a while, I thought that was what Daniel's proposal would be, the perfect beginning of a life we had been quietly shaping, a private declaration of forever born not out of ceremony or spectacle, but out of something stronger, something more enduring than the shallow affirmations I had grown up around. It happened during a weekend getaway we had taken on impulse, a rare 3-day stretch where neither of us had obligations, shifts, or social expectations weighing down our hours, just time stretched wide and slow like the lake we'd rented the cabin beside. Daniel had packed a cooler with homemade pasta salad and the leftover blackberry cobbler from earlier that week, the kind of small, thoughtful gesture he did often, never loud, never performative, just intentional in a way that always made my heart ache a little with how rare that kind of presence had become in my life. We sat on the cabin porch that overlooked the water, the sun folding gently behind the hills, casting gold over everything, and he reached into the pocket of his fleece jacket and pulled out the ring without theatrics or speeches. "I don't need a perfect moment," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but weighted with everything unsaid between us, "just the right person to spend the rest of mine with." And I said yes before my breath could catch, before doubt could whisper, before memory could interfere, yes with tears in my eyes and hands trembling against his, yes with all the softness I had been taught to hide, yes because in that moment, I truly believed love could outweigh legacy. We didn't call anyone that night. We didn't post a photo. We just lay wrapped in each other's arms on that creaky old porch swing, listening to the hush of the lake and the creaking of the wood as it rocked beneath our weight, 2 people, suspended between peace and everything waiting beyond the shoreline. But reality, as always, has a cruel sense of timing. I told my parents the next morning, after we returned to the city, still slightly sunburned and windswept, with the ring a secret, glittering thing tucked in my pocket like a talisman I wasn't ready to share with the world. We met for brunch at their favorite hotel, one of those places with linen napkins and an orchestra of silverware, and I waited until after the waiter had poured the coffee, until my mother had taken exactly 3 sips and my father had commented on the subpar selection of the fruit plate. "I'm engaged," I said, sliding the ring onto my finger and holding my hand just far enough into the sunlight that it caught the light. There was a silence that descended so fast and so completely it felt like someone had vacuum sealed the air out of the room. My mother didn't even look at the ring. She stared at her espresso like it had personally betrayed her. My father leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and said after a moment too long to be considered casual, "We thought you had better judgment than this. No congratulations. No curiosity. Just a judgment so sharp it could have sliced through the delicate stemware between us." They didn't ask when the wedding was. They didn't ask how he proposed. They didn't ask anything at all. Instead, my mother finally looked up and asked if I had considered what this meant for my future, as though I had announced a terminal illness instead of a life partnership. The silence between us stretched into something colder than distance. It became a presence at every dinner, every call, every event, something that pressed against me even when I was alone, like a bruise beneath the skin that hadn't yet changed color. I didn't tell Daniel how bad it had been that day. I didn't tell him how my mother had whispered later that evening, "You're throwing away your potential," as if marrying someone who held dying hands for a living was equivalent to abandoning my own life's purpose. But he knew. He knew because the next time we had dinner at my parents' home, the one with the curated shelves and the bone-white china, we were served politeness like poison disguised as tea. They smiled at him, but the words they used were hollow, always laced with qualifiers and careful omissions, backhanded compliments that danced the line between civility and contempt. "Oh, Daniel, it must be so emotionally rewarding to work in hospice," my mother would say, drawing out the words like she was discussing a quaint hobby, not a calling that took more courage than she had ever shown me. "Must be tough, though," my father added once, swirling his scotch like the smugness in his tone, knowing there's not really a future in that kind of career. I watched Daniel absorb it with the same grace he offered his patients, nodding, smiling politely, choosing not to fight the venom because he knew it would only poison the air further. But I also watched how his shoulders tightened when they turned their attention away, how he stopped reaching for second helpings, how he began volunteering to stay behind for the next few dinners. I told myself I was protecting him. That silence was the shield I had been taught to wield. What I didn't realize was how deeply that silence was cutting both of us. They started excluding him from family discussions, the ones that used to be trivial and now somehow mattered, like vacations, family trusts, estate decisions, all things that suddenly became urgent whenever I showed up alone. Even my cousin Beth, who had always been the least venomous among them, began slipping. "I can't wait for the wedding," she said one night, laughing over drinks. "Will Daniel wear scrubs down the aisle?" Everyone laughed. I didn't. Not because it wasn't meant to be a joke, but because it revealed the truth about how they saw him, not as a man, not even as a partner, but as a symbol of everything they couldn't control about me anymore. Later that night, as we walked home in the drizzle, Daniel's hand gripped mine but his jaw was tight, his eyes cast forward like he was rehearsing something painful. And then, in the soft glow of our apartment hallway, he turned to me and said with a voice low and worn thin by restraint, "You protect them from me, Aurora." But who protects me from them? The words hit like a fault line cracking beneath everything we had built. I had no answer. Because the truth was, I had been trying so hard to balance on the tightrope between two worlds that I hadn't noticed the rope was fraying, my silence, their mockery, his quiet endurance, all threads unraveling beneath the weight of my fear. I hadn't wanted to choose. But the longer I waited, the more obvious it became that the choice was being made for me. And soon, something was going to break. From the moment I opened my eyes on the morning of my wedding, a heavy weight settled in my chest, pressing down with the suffocating force of unspoken fears and unresolved tensions. The sunlight filtered through the ornate curtains of the bridal suite, casting golden patterns on the floor, but the warmth did little to alleviate the chill that had taken residence in my heart. I stood before the full-length mirror, adorned in the gown I had once dreamed of, a cascade of ivory lace and delicate beadwork that shimmered with every movement. It was the dress I had envisioned since childhood, a symbol of love and new beginnings. Yet, as I gazed at my reflection, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was playing a role in a production scripted by others. My parents had insisted on a grand, opulent ceremony, complete with a guest list that read like a who's who of their social circle. They had spared no expense, ensuring every detail exuded luxury and prestige. Daniel, ever the supportive partner, had expressed indifference to the extravagance, focusing instead on the significance of our union. Still, I couldn't help but feel that the day was more about appearances than the love we shared. As I walked down the aisle, my arm linked with my father's, I felt the eyes of hundreds of guests upon me. Their gazes were filled with admiration, curiosity, and, in some cases, judgment. Daniel stood at the altar, his eyes locked onto mine, offering a reassuring smile that momentarily eased my anxiety. The ceremony proceeded with the expected pomp and circumstance, each moment choreographed to perfection. Vows were exchanged, rings slipped onto fingers, and the officiant pronounced us husband and wife. Applause erupted as we shared our first kiss as a married couple, a moment that should have been filled with unbridled joy. Yet, beneath my smile, a storm of emotions brewed. The reception hall was a testament to my parents' desire for grandeur, a lavish space adorned with crystal chandeliers, towering floral arrangements, and tables set with the finest china. Guests mingled, sipping champagne and indulging in gourmet hors d'oeuvres, their laughter and conversation creating a cacophony that felt both festive and overwhelming. Dinner was served, and as plates were cleared, it was time for the speeches, a tradition meant to celebrate love and unity. Daniel's best man delivered a heartfelt tribute, recounting stories of their friendship and the qualities that made Daniel an exceptional partner. I felt a swell of pride and gratitude for the man I had chosen to marry. Then, my father took the microphone. He began with a few anecdotes from my childhood, eliciting polite laughter from the audience. But as he continued, his tone shifted, and the words that followed would be etched into my memory forever. "Well," he said, pausing for effect, "not every bride marries a brain surgeon. But love is love, right?" The room erupted in laughter, a sound that felt like daggers piercing my skin. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced at Daniel, whose expression remained stoic, his jaw clenched tightly. My mother, seated beside him, added with a forced smile, "At least he knows how to fold a blanket." More laughter followed, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. The man I loved, who had stood by me through every challenge, was being reduced to a punchline in front of our friends and family. I opened my mouth to speak, to defend Daniel, to confront the cruelty masked as humor. But the words caught in my throat, choked by years of conditioning to maintain peace and avoid confrontation. I was paralyzed, torn between loyalty to my husband and fear of shattering the fragile facade of familial harmony. Before I could gather the courage to respond, a voice rang out from the back of the room. It was Daniel's mother, a woman of quiet strength who had remained in the background throughout the day's festivities. She stood, her posture erect, her gaze unwavering. "That is enough," she said, her voice calm yet commanding. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward her. "My son is a compassionate, dedicated man who has devoted his life to caring for others. He deserves respect, not ridicule." Her words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the laughter that had filled the room moments before. I felt a surge of gratitude and shame, gratitude for her defense of Daniel, and shame for my own silence. The moment marked a turning point, a fracture in the carefully constructed image of familial perfection. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere remained tense, the earlier joviality replaced by an undercurrent of discomfort. Daniel and I danced our first dance as husband and wife, the music a soothing balm to the wounds inflicted by words. Yet, the pain lingered, a reminder of the cost of silence and the power of standing up for those we love. The silence that followed Daniel's mother's words was not the kind that invited recovery or redemption, it was the kind that settles deep in the lungs like smoke from a fire no one saw coming, choking out any attempt to pretend the damage hadn't already been done. She didn't speak loudly, didn't pound a fist against the table or demand anyone's attention, because she didn't have to. Her voice, steady and composed, carried the weight of decades of quiet observation, and when she said, "You're laughing at a man who holds hands with the dying when no one else will," the room fractured beneath the pressure of its own embarrassment. That single sentence, delivered without venom or tremble, landed with more force than a scream, and the sound of cutlery being slowly set down on porcelain became a symphony of guilt and awakening among guests who, until that moment, had thought themselves safe inside the armor of tradition, money, and well-timed applause. No one dared laugh after that, not even the ones who had chuckled the loudest moments before, because her words had pulled back the curtain with surgical precision, exposing the ugly truth of what they had just condoned with their silence and their smirks. I watched as shoulders stiffened, eyes lowered, and mouths tightened in shame. The air had shifted from celebratory to suffocating, as if the very oxygen had turned against the room for what it had witnessed. There were no gasps of protest, no rebuttals, no immediate attempts to reassert control with humor or charm, only the brittle clatter of someone nervously readjusting their champagne flute and the distant hum of the venue's air conditioner trying to cool a space that had just been set on fire from the inside out. Some guests turned their heads slightly away from Daniel, unable to look at him directly, not because of any disdain, but because they had just been made aware that they had treated him like less than human in a moment meant to honor love. Others, braver or perhaps just less practiced in denial, looked directly at him with expressions that spoke of apology without words, as though they were beginning to realize the extent of what had just transpired under the false pretense of celebration. Daniel remained seated throughout, unmoved in posture but unmistakably altered in presence. His jaw was clenched so tightly I could see the muscle pulse beneath the skin, but his eyes remained calm, fixed forward, unwavering in the kind of dignity that refuses to collapse even when the floor has been pulled out from underneath you. And it was in that unbearable stillness, surrounded by a room full of people who had been complicit in something so profoundly cruel, that I felt something within me begin to collapse, not out of defeat, but because I could no longer carry the weight of who I had been trying to be. I had tried so hard to be the daughter who could make everyone proud, the bridge between two worlds that were never meant to coexist, the silent peacemaker who bore the cost of keeping things calm without ever letting anyone see the storm inside. But standing there, beside a man whose only crime was loving me too quietly for my parents to understand, I realized my silence had not been noble, it had been cowardly, and it had made me a collaborator in their disrespect. I had let them make him small. I had let them treat him as less. I had told myself I was keeping the peace, when in truth, I had been preserving a hierarchy that had no place in the kind of life I claimed I wanted to build. I looked at Daniel then, not as the man I had married, but as the man I had failed to protect in the most public moment of our lives, and I felt the burn of tears not from sadness, but from a grief deeper than mourning, the grief of having betrayed the one person who never asked me to be anyone but myself. The speech I had written, the one I had tucked neatly into my dress earlier that morning, the one filled with poetic anecdotes, carefully balanced humor, and well-rehearsed gratitude, suddenly felt like a lie waiting to be told. And I couldn't do it. I wouldn't. Not anymore. So I stood. Not because I had rehearsed this moment or because I had found the courage in time to make it comfortable, but because not standing would be the final betrayal in a day already soaked in regret. There was a collective shift in the room as I reached for the microphone, the kind of movement that comes not from curiosity, but from recognition that something irreversible is about to happen. I took a breath, not to compose myself, but to ensure that when I spoke, the truth wouldn't shake. I had a speech prepared, I said, my voice louder than I expected, not because I was shouting, but because I wasn't hiding anymore, but I'm not going to read it, because it doesn't belong in this moment. I didn't wait for anyone to interject. This day was supposed to be about love, I continued, scanning the crowd filled with faces I had once known but could now barely recognize beneath the masks of etiquette and inherited condescension, but what happened tonight wasn't love, and I won't pretend it was. My eyes found Daniel, and I let the words come without filter, without editing, without fear of how they would land. You are the only person here who has never made me feel like I needed to prove my worth just to exist. Someone gasped, I think. It might have been my mother, though I didn't look to check. You gave me a home when I didn't even know I was homeless, I said, and now my voice broke, not because I was weak, but because the truth, when finally spoken aloud, carries the weight of every moment it was silenced. You loved me without asking me to be more palatable, more acceptable, more aligned with the kind of life my family believes is the only life worth admiring. Still, I didn't stop. And I let them treat you like less, I said, my voice cracking again, not from nerves, but from something more ancient and guttural, the sorrow of a woman realizing too late that her silence had become complicity. I smiled when they made jokes, I stayed quiet when they excluded you, I rationalized their cruelty as tradition, and I let you carry the burden of my cowardice because I was too afraid to burn a bridge that was never safe for me to cross. A few guests had tears in their eyes now, not crocodile tears, but the kind that come from being forced to see something you cannot unsee. I'm done performing, I said, and this time the strength in my voice was not manufactured, it was born from a line finally drawn, one I would not let them cross again. This is not just my husband. This is the man who shows up for strangers when their own families don't bother. This is the man who has held hands with the dying so they wouldn't have to die alone. Now I turned toward the head table, where my parents sat frozen, both of them looking older than I had ever seen them before, less powerful, less polished, less certain of their ability to shape the narrative around them. I am not ashamed of him, I said, locking eyes with my father, who had once told me that marrying Daniel was a phase I'd regret, but I am ashamed of what I allowed. And with that, I set the microphone down. There was no applause. No forced clapping. Just silence, deep, clean, reverent silence. The kind of silence that comes not from shock, but from respect. People began to move, some slowly approaching Daniel to shake his hand or murmur apologies with trembling voices, others retreating to the corners of the room, suddenly aware of the space their laughter had once occupied. My mother remained seated, her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for someone to tell her what to do next. My father looked straight ahead, not in defiance, but in defeat. And me? I walked back to Daniel, not as a bride returning to her groom, but as a woman returning to herself. He took my hand in his, not to comfort me, but to confirm that we were, finally, standing on the same ground. And in that grip, I felt no bitterness, no punishment, no wounded pride, only love. The kind that doesn't need permission. The kind that doesn't flinch when tested. The kind that, once spoken, refuses to be silenced again. There are moments in your life that don't explode like fireworks or thunderclaps but rather bloom like morning light across a hardwood floor, quiet, slow, and entirely unignorable. Our new life did not begin with a grand exodus or dramatic renunciation, no packing of boxes under midnight skies or slamming of doors with declarations of rebellion echoing behind us. Instead, it started in the stillness after the storm, when the guests had gone home, the flowers had wilted, and only the truth remained, raw and clean as bone. Daniel and I returned to our apartment that night without ceremony. We changed out of our wedding clothes like shedding skins we had long outgrown, then sat on the living room floor in sweatpants, eating leftover cake with our hands, laughing between mouthfuls at how absurd and terrible the day had been, and how grateful we were it was finally over. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. Because in that quiet, unpolished moment, I knew with certainty that we had nothing left to prove and no one left to impress. Our marriage began not with applause, but with a reckoning, and from that reckoning, something truer took root than anything I had ever known. A few weeks after the wedding, Daniel was promoted to head of palliative care at the hospice where he had worked for years with a devotion that had never once sought recognition. When they called to offer him the position, I watched the muscles in his shoulders relax for the first time in months, as though someone had finally said, "We see you," and this time, it came with both respect and responsibility. He accepted the job with his usual humility, but that night, when we toasted with cheap red wine and mismatched glasses in our tiny kitchen, I saw something flicker in his eyes, something like pride, but deeper. At the same time, I left my corporate job, the one my father had always described as impressive, though never once asked what I actually did or why I cared about it. It had taken me months to admit that every morning felt like suffocation, every meeting like a rehearsal for a part I'd been told to play, not one I had chosen for myself. So I walked away, not in rage or haste, but in absolute clarity. I enrolled in a certification program for art therapy, a field I had once brushed aside as impractical but now saw as the intersection of everything I loved: creation, compassion, and quiet transformation. The first time I sat with a trauma patient and watched them express what they couldn't say with words through color and line, I felt something shift in me, like coming home to a part of myself I'd buried under years of performance and parental expectation. We didn't move into a bigger place. We didn't buy a luxury car or post curated photos of our life online to prove anything to anyone. What we did do was begin again, with intention. We chose furniture not for its brand but for its comfort, filled the walls with art that made us feel something instead of match something, and planted herbs in the windowsill that we routinely forgot to water and yet somehow thrived anyway. We stopped explaining ourselves to people who didn't want to understand and started sharing ourselves with those who did. Which brings me to my parents. After the wedding, I didn't speak to them for nearly 6 months. Not because I was punishing them or nursing resentment like a wound I wanted to keep raw, but because I needed to rebuild the boundaries they had trampled for years in the name of legacy and image. Eventually, I wrote them a letter. Not an angry one. Not a manifesto of every grievance and slight. Just a clear, steady truth, written in my own voice for the first time since I was a child. I told them that I was no longer interested in pretending. That I would not be raising children in a home where empathy was mocked and kindness was seen as weakness. That if they wanted to be part of my life moving forward, they would need to meet us there, in the space where love is measured not by achievement or aesthetics, but by presence, patience, and truth. I didn't expect a reply, and for a long time I didn't get one. But I no longer needed it. Because while I had spent most of my life twisting myself into a shape that would win their approval, I now understood that the love I had built with Daniel didn't require permission to exist. It just was. We spent holidays with Daniel's mother, who had become not just family but sanctuary. Her warmth was never performative. She didn't serve meals with expectations or compliments with conditions. She just opened her home, her arms, and her heart without asking for anything in return. Our friends joined us often, bringing their kids, their dogs, their mismatched chaos into our world with the kind of joyful disorder that once would have made my mother flinch. Daniel cooked. I painted. Sometimes we played board games for hours, and other times we just sat in silence, listening to music while the kettle whistled. Our life became smaller, but infinitely richer. We weren't building an empire. We were building a sanctuary. We weren't climbing a ladder. We were growing roots. And when our daughter was born, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in a delivery room filled with nothing but soft music and Daniel's hand in mine, I cried not from fear or exhaustion, but from the overwhelming gratitude of knowing that she would never have to unlearn the lie that love must be earned. We named her Elise, after the first piece of music I ever learned to play on the piano, back when I still believed art had a place in my life. As she grew, we filled our days with stories, messes, and mistakes, letting her paint on the walls sometimes, letting her cry without being told to hush, letting her exist without the constant pressure to be pleasing. She became exactly who she was meant to be. And years later, many years, though not so many that the memory of the wedding had faded entirely, I found myself in our kitchen, now sunlit and painted the color of apricots, sitting beside Elise at the long wooden table while we painted pictures of whatever lived in her imagination that day. Daniel walked in, carrying 2 mugs of tea and a plate of scones he had baked from a recipe he found online that he claimed to have adjusted for magic. He kissed the top of my head without needing a reason, ruffled Elise's curls, and set the tea down in front of me like it was sacred. Laughter echoed in the room, not staged, not performative, not curated for show, but full and round and real. And in that moment, I understood something I had spent most of my life chasing. Approval is a cage disguised as reward. Silence is not safety, it's surrender. Love, when it's real, doesn't ask you to shrink. It dares you to take up space. To risk being seen. To speak even when your voice shakes. And to build, from the wreckage of what you were taught, something infinitely braver. Your own damn life. And in that kitchen, with my daughter's paint-streaked fingers in mine and Daniel's quiet smile meeting mine across the table, I knew I had done it. I had not just survived my legacy. I had rewritten it. In full color. Without apology. Forever.